In my programme yesterday, I discussed how attempts to start up some kind of dialogue with Russia have been underway, launched by veterans of the US foreign policy establishment, led by the outgoing president, Richard Haass, of the Council for Foreign Relations. At the same time, I also pointed out that there are major obstacles within the US government. The President himself continues to be committed to his policy of support for Ukraine, and of course, other figures within the government are also similarly supportive of the conflict in Ukraine and have not yet given up hope that somehow, in some way, things will be turned round. And yesterday, we saw this group once more in the ascendant. There's been more announcements of more weapons deliveries to Ukraine, and in fact, this has been the largest aid package for some time. My understanding is that its value is around $800 million. So this is a big package, and we're told that the military aid will include 32 Stryker armoured personnel carriers, 32 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 31 155mm howitzers, we'll come to that in a moment, over 28 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenades, Stinger anti-aircraft systems, Javelin and other anti-armour systems and rockets, AIM-7 Sparrow missiles for air defence, and tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided tow missiles. And as well as that, there will also be further ammunition for the HIMARS systems and for the Patriots. And this is, as I said, a big aid package. But of course, the biggest part of it is not this list of items that I've discussed, important though that is. It is the supply of cluster munitions, of cluster shells, which the United States is now going to provide to Ukraine, though it is careful not to disclose the quantity of these shells. Now, what is most interesting about this particular package is certain statements that US officials have made alongside this package, and the most important comes from no less a person than the President of the United States, Joe Biden himself. He has straightforwardly admitted that the reason that the United States is now supplying cluster munitions to Ukraine is because it has run out of other types of shells, proper shells, unitary shells, that it can supply instead. So Ukraine is not going to get the normal 155mm shells, it's going to get cluster munitions instead. And I'm not an expert on shells, but others who are say that this is going to leave the Ukrainian military in a worse position, because cluster shells are specific shells intended for certain specific roles. They're not general purpose shells, but it seems that Ukraine's stockpile of these is depleting fast, and the United States is not able to replace it. And cluster shells, even allowing for the fact that the United States still has a substantial stockpile of these, around 3.3 million, according to the Financial Times, are not a full substitute for the conventional high explosive shells which the Ukraine relies upon. I understand, as a matter of fact, that cluster shells, quite apart from the humanitarian objections to them, which I'll come to in a moment, are relatively old munitions anyway. It seems that this type of shell, its role has been taken up by other types of shells. I'm not going to discuss that further. I'm not an expert on in this area at all. But anyway, it appears that the United States has run out of whatever those other types of shells are, which have a similar effect also. So this is a case of the United States making do by supplying what it has, rather than making a purposeful decision to supply cluster munitions. And this has been said by the President of the United States. It's also been said by his National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. It's been said or hinted at by other officials as well. And I think this time, just for once, we should take them at their word. Scott Ritter, who is much more expert about these kind of things than I am, he is, after all, former Marine Corps officer. He's actually made precisely this point, that in fact these are shells, cluster munitions, that the United States is having to provide to Ukraine because it has run out of other shells it can send in their place. And clearly, not only now are stocks of conventional, of proper shells in the United States and in Europe catastrophically depleted, but also all supplies of shells from other countries, from Japan, from South Korea, from Pakistan, they've run down now to the point where those countries also are not prepared to supply any more real shells. And I don't know what effect these cluster munitions will have on the battlefields, whether they will be supplied to Ukraine whilst its current offensive is underway. Biden and Sullivan appeared to imply that they would be, though I would have thought that transporting large numbers of shells not be an easy task. But regardless of that, it isn't a good sign for the way in which events are shaping out on the battlefields. And in fact, there's been more statements to this effect by other US officials. The Pentagon has now straightforwardly admitted that the progress in the offensive has been disappointing, that they're not making the progress, that the Ukrainians are not making the progress that the Pentagon had expected. And Corriere della Sera, a journalist from Corriere della Sera, Italian newspaper, he's been to the Bakhmut area where the Ukrainians have been claiming various advances. He's flatly contradicted Ukrainian claims. He said that the Ukrainians have not advanced by a single meter. That's probably an overstatement. He also says that the Ukrainians still suffering from a dearth of modern equipment. He says that they were reduced to using a mortar, an Italian mortar from the 1960s. Well, I'm not going to go into those details. But anyway, he does not paint an optimistic picture of the progress of Ukraine's offensive in the Bakhmut area. This despite the fact, by the way, that in the media, certainly here in Britain, they still continue to recycle Ukrainian claims that they continue to make advances in the Bakhmut area, though it is clear that as of now, the villages that Ukraine has been trying to recapture, Klesheyevka, Kurtyumovka, Belkovka, that they are still firmly under Russian control. So perhaps it's not the case that Ukraine hasn't advanced a single meter, but it seems that Ukraine hasn't achieved the breakthrough that it claims, despite the reporting in Britain based on Ukrainian claims that it has. So there we are. The situation remains on the front lines in deadlock. The United States is admitting to its disappointment, and the United States has run out of shells and so has to supply Ukraine with cluster munitions instead. Now, the Russians have made a number of points about this. They've pointed out that their stocks of cluster munitions are multiples greater than those of the US. So if Ukraine starts to use cluster munitions, then Russia can do so as well. Of course, the US and Ukraine and Britain and Human Rights Watch all claim that Russia has already used cluster munitions in the war. This has been denied by the Russians themselves and by other sources, even the Pentagon, as Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama has said, acknowledged in March and May of last year that they'd seen no positive proof that the Russians had indeed used cluster munitions in the war. But anyway, the fact is that the Russians apparently have many more of these than the US does. And of course, as I said, these are perhaps anyway no longer the cutting edge weapons that they used to be. And in terms of at least of the US stockpile, parts of it is quite old now. The United States is saying that the dud rate of these clusters of small munitions when they're fired from these guns is relatively low, but some of these munitions are 20 years old. They've been in storage for a while. There's been claims that the Pentagon anyway understates very significantly the real dud rate of these munitions. The United States is on record. A Russian diplomat has actually posted a video of this, of a US diplomat. Anyway, the United States is on record as condemning the use of cluster munitions, and as I said, a Russian diplomat has actually posted a video of a US diplomat doing that very thing. Many countries ban the use of cluster munitions. It's widely prohibited. Hundreds of countries, in fact, have signed up to that prohibition. Though, importantly, the United States, China, and Russia are not amongst those countries. But anyway, it seems that there have been moves towards banning the use of cluster munitions, and the United States, notwithstanding that at times it too has criticized the use of cluster munitions, now says that it is going to supply cluster munitions to Ukraine. And this is such a dramatic reversal of position. The United States supplying to Ukraine a weapon which is outlawed in much of the world and which the use of which it has itself criticized, that for the first time there's been some pushback, there's been criticism from some of the US's allies, Germany, for example, and there's been criticism within the United States as well, from Human Rights Watch and even from some Democrat members of Congress, though nowhere near enough to make any real difference or to prevent this delivery. And the reaction in most places in the West is to shrug shoulders. And of course, the NATO Secretariat says that they have no issues, no concerns with this particular delivery. This, by the way, is now becoming something of a pattern. As I said, we've had supplies of depleted uranium shells by Britain and the United States to Ukraine. There's been much criticism in the past in the West of the use of these types of shells used by tanks and sometimes in the past US helicopter gunships. Not anymore, I understand. But anyway, there's been criticism of the use of depleted uranium munitions in the past, but when they are being supplied to Ukraine, the critics have been silent, and over the supply of cluster munitions, there's been rather more criticism, but not enough to make any significant difference, not enough to change things politically, to alter the narrative of the story, to galvanize opposition, to do anything of that kind. I have to say that the way Western governments, especially the US government, but also the British and other governments, are able to cross their own red lines. And let me reiterate, these are self-imposed Western red lines, not Russian-imposed red lines. These are self-imposed Western red lines. The extent to which they're prepared to do that, and apparently do so without embarrassment, astonishes me, especially given the enormous amount of moralizing and ethical posturing that there has been about the use of these weapons, specifically about the use of cluster weapons by not just Western civil society figures, if I can call them that, but by Western officials and Western diplomats in the past. But there we are, perhaps in a conflict like the one in Ukraine, where the stakes are so high, that shouldn't surprise us. I have always said that one of the problems with war is that even if one starts with good intentions, one tells oneself that one isn't going to do certain things, the imperative of winning and the even greater imperative of avoiding defeat eventually cause all of these constraints to break down. And one can see that happening with the West, the conduct of the West, in terms of the arms supplies that it is sending to the Ukrainian battlefields. Now, before I leave this topic, I just wanted to say something else, because of course there's been a very well organized and effective campaign against cluster munitions in the past, which has now been effectively set at naught, or largely at naught, by the decision to supply Ukraine with cluster munitions. There's been concerns, as I've discussed, about depleted uranium shells, but there's also been, in the past, within relatively recent memory, major campaigns about the use of landmines. I can remember in Britain that King Charles III's former wife, late wife, Princess Diana, the Princess of Wales, she was a major campaigner for the abolition of landmines. Now, it is fair to say that, again, the great powers, the United States, Russia, China, never went along with this. But I did notice that in the early stages of this war, the Russians seemed to be very sparing in their use of landmines. And one of the reasons why Ukraine's Kharkiv offensive was so successful in capturing so much territory in such a small period of time was because the Russians had taken no steps to plant large minefields, as perhaps plausibly they might have done. There was no minefields, for example, planted around the very lightly defended town of Balaklia, which was one of the first places that Ukraine captured over the course of that particular offensive. And this, by the way, resulted in vigorous criticism of the laxity, the negligence of the Russian military in its failure to plant landmines, which appeared in various Russian blog posts of the Russian media, in all those sort of things. Now, there might have been military reasons for this, or there might have been incompetence, or it might have been that the Russians anyway had said to themselves, we're probably going to withdraw from this area anyway, so what's the point in planting minefields? It did also occur to me at the time that just possibly the reason the Russians weren't using mines very much in the early stages of the war was because they were mindful of the criticisms of the use of landmines that had been made in the past, and they didn't want to be criticized because of that. And maybe someone in Moscow also had some moral inhibitions about using landmines. Well, if those inhibitions did exist, be they political, military, or ethical, they've all gone away. The Russians have been planting landmines all over the place, all over the battle lines in Ukraine, and they've had devastating effect in blunting Ukraine's offensive. So there we go. As I said, it's what happens in war. It's, as I said, one reason why war should, in general, be avoided. And we're seeing it playing out on the battlefields of Ukraine. But anyway, criticism there has been of landmines. It never gained the traction that criticism of cluster munitions has achieved. As I said, there's an international convention which many countries have signed up, outlawing their use, but the United States, as I said, has now just gone ahead and has supplied these cluster munitions because, as it itself admits, it has no other alternative if this conflict, if Ukraine's military position is going to be sustained. Now, I am going to touch now on the other weapons deliveries that the United States is making to Ukraine. So we told about the additional munitions for the Patriot and HIMARS systems. Now, the HIMARS, Ukraine uses it much less than previously. Apparently the stocks are not unlimited, and as discussed in previous videos, it seems that the Russians are now increasingly effective in shooting down HIMARS missiles and in jamming their signals, and the HIMARS altogether has become a much less effective weapon than it was. But the United States is able to produce HIMARS rockets, HIMARS missiles, and it will continue to be able to do so and to continue to supply Ukraine with these missiles. Not perhaps at quite the level that it did last year, but some supply of HIMARS missiles can take place. Patriot munitions for the Patriot system is much more problematic. Production of Patriot missiles is relatively low. Apparently, it will take years before it can be increased significantly. Ukraine is having to use Patriot missiles at huge numbers. Of course, the Russians claim, plausibly, that they've already destroyed several Patriot launchers. It's debatable whether the US can continue to supply Ukraine with Patriot missiles to equip the launchers to an unlimited extent if it is to fulfill its own needs, which are great, and those of its other allies. So this is a delivery, probably one that the United States would rather not make, or at least the US military would rather not make. But there it is. And then we're told that the United States is going to provide 32 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and 32 Stryker armoured personnel carriers. Now, in the past, the United States has said that it is supplying these vehicles one for one to replace those which Ukraine has already lost. If that is the case, then Ukrainian losses of these vehicles have been extremely high. Even if that is not the case, even if the United States is trying to increase deliveries of armored vehicles, of these armored vehicles, beyond those that Ukraine has lost, what we can see is that already Ukraine is needing more armored vehicles than the United States calculated that it would need back in the winter and early spring when it started to equip Ukraine for its offensive. The US was repeatedly saying that it had, before the offensive began, that it had supplied Ukraine with all the systems that it needed for the offensive if these 64 vehicles, 32 Bradleys and 32 Strykers, include more than just replacements for vehicles already supplied and lost, then the United States is admitting that it's indirectly admitting, implicitly admitting, that its previous supplies of these vehicles was insufficient. And though the United States does have a very large stock of Bradleys and Strykers, again, this is not unlimited, and already one can see that with these vehicles apparently out of production, the United States is having to eat into its stockpiles faster than perhaps it might have anticipated. Anyway, there we go. So we learn about precision aerial munitions. This is presumably some kind of Excalibur system, or who knows exactly. Demolitions, munitions and systems for obstacle clearing, mine clearing equipment and spare parts for all of that. Well, I'm going to make a guess. This is largely replacing equipment that Ukraine has already lost. Ukraine was supplied with enormous quantities of systems before the offensive for obstacle clearing, mine clearing, and all the rest, and it has proved largely ineffectual. There's lots of pictures out there of mine clearing vehicles, including vehicles based on Leopard tanks and such things, littering the battlefield after they've been destroyed by the Russian military. And then, of course, we come to the 31 155mm howitzers. Now, there's been lots of reports that Ukraine is now running very short of M777s. Most of them have been destroyed, and lots of reports that Ukraine's other guns have also been destroyed as well. So these almost certainly simply replace, up to a certain point, guns which have been supplied to Ukraine, but which have been already lost. Now, I'm not going to discuss the 28 million rounds of small arms ammunition. Brian Beletic does that far better than me, but it seems that that isn't actually such a large number of, such a large amount of ammunition. And, of course, Stinger anti-aircraft systems and javelins, and these tow missiles. Apparently, this Brian Beletic has explained at the new Atlas how these require lots of training. We now know that Ukrainian troops are becoming increasingly short in training, and nonetheless they're being supplied despite the fact that the arsenals have been catastrophically run down. Production of Stingers and Javelins hasn't really started. Apparently Raytheon, which I believe makes the Stinger, is trying to track down retired workers to try to bring them back into the production lines to get them to start making these Stingers again. Anyway, whatever is left, perhaps the US has been hunting around the world for these things. Whatever is left, they're sending them to Ukraine. And as for the AIM-7 missiles for air defense, these are probably being supplied again, I'm guessing now, again, Brian Beletic is the expert on this, they're presumably being supplied not for Ukrainian aircraft, fighter jets, but for the anti-aircraft batteries, some of which apparently use these converted air-to-air missiles on a land-to-air role, and they've not been, it must be said, hugely effective in the past. So, a big package of weapons, but in some ways, a package which highlights failure and weakness. The United States is now driven to supplying cluster munitions, despite all of the political and public relations problems that causes, because it's run out of shells, and the United States has to supply more Strikers, more howitzers, and more Bradleys, simply to make up for the losses that have already taken place, or in the alternative, in the case of the Bradleys and the Strikers, in a kind of cack-handed admission that the original number supplied, despite US assertions, was not enough, with the United States now perhaps confronted with the possibility of an unlimited demand for these machines from Ukraine, just as Ukraine's demand for artillery shells, guns, drones, aircraft is turning out to be unlimited as well. Now, what is the purpose of all of this? Now, Biden and Sullivan have both said that the cluster munitions are going to be supplied for only as long as is needed until production rates for conventional 155mm shells have increased to the level when the United States can continue to supply them. Well, we have lots of production figures from the United States. It's absolutely clear that the United States lacks the ability not only to meet Russian production rates, which are multiples greater, but more worryingly, to meet, even at the elevated production figures for 155mm shells that it is talking about, to meet even Ukrainian requirements. Ukraine is expending many more shells than the United States is able to produce in any possible realistic time frame. So Sullivan and Blinken may be saying this, that this is only to tide the US over until they can supply 155mm shells, conventional shells again, and no doubt eventually they will resume doing that, but the quantities are never going to be enough, and they will never be as great, I suspect, as they were last year and in the first months of this year. And in the meantime, of course, Ukraine will have to make do with less effective cluster munitions. And to my mind, that tells us two things. Firstly, it tells us that Ukraine is now critically short of shells. In a video that I did 2 days ago, I said that the limiting factor in terms of time for this Ukrainian offensive was shells, the number of shells that Ukraine still had in its stockpiles. I worked on the assumption that Ukraine had around 1 million 155mm shells that it had been supplied for the offensive. I said that it was being depleted, probably at a high rate, say around 10,000 shells a day, to sustain the offensive at the level that an offensive needs to be sustained. And I also said that 100 days seemed to me a realistic length of time before shell shortages began to become critical, and making it impossible to sustain the offensive to any realistic degree. Now, of course, what I did not factor in was possible Russian success in destroying ammunition stocks. The Russians have engaged in a massive missile and drone campaign for several weeks, for several months in fact, which by the way continues, knocking out Ukrainian depots of missiles and ammunition. There's been major explosions at ammunition dumps in Pavlograd, in Khmelnytsky, and in other places. I didn't factor that in because, of course, the quantities of shells and ammunition and equipment destroyed in these attacks is unknowable. But I wonder whether perhaps that aerial campaign has been more effective than perhaps even the most pessimistic or optimistic, depending on your point of view, analysts supposed, and whether perhaps Ukrainian stocks of shells have become even more rapidly depleted than I expected. In which case, perhaps that 100-day timeline for the offensive was an over-optimistic one. Certainly a fact that Ukraine has changed its tactics over the course of the offensive. It's no longer trying big armoured thrusts. It's trying to conserve its equipment to the extent that it can do, though the Russians still continue to publish reports every day of infantry fighting vehicles, including Bradleys and Strykers, which they say have been destroyed, and there's no one to contradict them. But anyway, on the actual battle lines, especially in the Zaporozhye region, the general consensus is that to the extent that Ukraine continues to launch attacks at all, they tend to be light infantry attacking under some degree of artillery cover, but that this isn't particularly successful, and that the casualties, in fact not successful at all, and that the casualties, the human losses Ukraine is incurring through this change of tactics have been extremely high. So, what is the purpose of all of this? Is it to prolong the offensive? Well, it might be, but I can't help but ask myself whether, in that case, this new package of equipment is going to be anywhere near sufficient to achieve that goal of a breakthrough. It seems to me that there is at least another possibility, which is that the purpose of this is not to keep the offensive going, it is to keep the war going. It is to prevent a Ukrainian collapse over the next few weeks and months. The United States and the West rushed equipment to Ukraine last summer, in my opinion, at least as much for that same reason, because after the very heavy losses Ukraine incurred in the first months of the conflict, the Ukrainian military had run through most of its equipment, much of its equipment. It had taken severe losses in manpower as well, and there may have been fears in the early part of the summer, after the Russian capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, that Ukraine might in fact, if it wasn't supplied with equipment quickly, that it might actually collapse. And I wonder whether the same isn't true this time, whether in fact the United States, the President and his advisors aren't concerned that with Ukraine having exhausted its shell stockpile, having suffered serious losses in equipment, which these can only, the latest delivery can only very partially replace, whether there isn't a real risk that at some point over the next few months, Ukraine might run out of everything and that there might be a sudden collapse. Now, with an election coming in the United States next year, that is something that the administration would want to prevent at all costs, and that might explain why they're now pulling out the stops, why they're supplying Ukraine with cluster munitions and depleting whatever limited stockpiles are left of javelins and stingers, and sending to Ukraine what are apparently already significantly reduced stockpiles of howitzers, because of course the political clock in the United States is ticking, and the one thing the president probably calculates that he cannot afford is another military defeat, a very, very serious military defeat, coming just a few years after the collapse of the US position in Afghanistan. So we can see how the achievement of victory in Ukraine, however that is defined, is now perhaps, just possibly, being put to one side as the United States, or at least the administration, starts to confront domestic political imperatives. Now, whether this can be sustained for very long, whether the United States can continue to cobble together enough weapons to keep Ukraine on a kind of drip feed, is another matter. And I'm not going to explore this. 3.3 million cluster munitions sounds like a lot, but Ukraine has probably already run through at least 2 million rounds of 155mm shells. I'm guessing that many of these cluster munitions, the stockpile is quite old in places. As I said, some of them probably decades old by now. They might not be usable. And besides, Scott Ritter says that they're not particularly effective either, or at least they're less effective than the conventional shells that Ukraine is using. And of course, as I've also discussed in recent programs, Russian forces are growing in strength. They're fielding more and more tanks, more and more infantry fighting vehicles, more and more types of machines, and of course they're recruiting more and more men every day, 1,400 a day. They're building up their forces at great speed. So whether it's enough is another matter. But that brings us back to the question of the diplomacy. And President Biden, in early comments on the eve of the Vilnius summit meeting, has in effect acknowledged that Ukraine is not going to enter NATO at any immediate point in time. He said that it cannot do so whilst the conflict is underway. I find it astonishing that Western leaders don't understand that holding out for Ukraine the possibility that it might enter NATO after the war is over simply incentivizes Russia to continue the war, which all the indications are that it can most emphatically do. But anyway, President Biden has again said that Ukraine cannot enter NATO now. Ukraine is going to be provided with all kinds of SOPs in its place. Stoltenberg has talked about the setting up of a NATO-Ukraine Council, in other words, another talking shop. He's talked about a reaffirmation by the West, by the NATO members, of Ukraine's eventual NATO membership. President Erdogan, rebuffed by Zelensky over Erdogan's requests that Ukraine should accept Turkey's role as a mediator, nonetheless repeated Turkey's long-standing position, his own long-standing position, even though it irritates the Russians, that Turkey supports Ukraine's NATO membership. He has a particular incentive to do that at the moment, because it looks increasingly like he's going to veto Sweden's application for NATO membership. But anyway, the reality is it's easy for Erdogan to say that because the United States has ruled Ukraine's membership out for the time being, and apparently other European states, European members of NATO, are not keen to go there either. So Stoltenberg talks about a Ukraine NATO Council. He talks about reaffirming the invitation for Ukraine eventually to join NATO. But the reality is that for the moment, at least, these are SOPs, and they're unwise and foolish SOPs, if only because they, in effect, incentivize Russia to continue the war until, as the Russians say, all of their objectives, which of course include Ukraine's neutralization, a commitment from Ukraine that it will never join NATO and will remain a neutral state. Well, the Russians, it incentivizes the Russians to press on with that. And of course, Biden, interestingly, gave us the reason why Ukraine can't join NATO, because he said that if Ukraine joins NATO now, that would mean that NATO would have to go to war with Russia. So, given that is his thinking, as I said, not only will that prolong the war, but he is in effect making the case that was outlined by the Washington realists, by the Council for Foreign Relations, and which is set out in that helpful article in Foreign Affairs, which is that the risks of bringing Ukraine into NATO outweigh the benefits, because the risks are that the United States could find itself dragged into a war with Russia, and that in reality, if that were to happen, the United States would be faced with a choice. Either it defends Ukraine, goes to war with Russia, or in the alternative, in order to avoid World War III and nuclear war, it doesn't, in which case its bluff is called, and so is NATO, and NATO in effect ends. So Biden, bizarrely, seems to be aware of this logic, but again, he's boxed himself now into a position where, having in effect started this war over the defense of the principle that Ukraine must be allowed to join NATO if it meets the eligibility criteria that NATO itself has decided, having, as I said, in effect triggered this war on that principle, he's now even as he understands or appears to understand the dangers of it. He can't go back on that, and the result is that we see continued affirmations of Ukraine's prospect of joining NATO one day, which, as I said, only incentivizes the Russians to continue, even as it becomes more and more difficult, as this latest arms package shows, for the United States and for the West to continue to sustain support for Ukraine through this war. It's an extraordinary tangle that the Western powers have got themselves into, especially the United States, and it's a sign, again, of President Biden's, and indeed of many Western leaders' inability to think this thing through properly, something which, by the way, continues to be the case. Meanwhile, by the way, there are increasing criticisms of President Biden in Britain, with the British still furious over his decision to veto the appointment of Ben Wallace as NATO Secretary General. But anyway, we get articles starting to appear like this one in the Daily Telegraph. Now, I'm going to read some extracts of this article because we at the DURAN have received some pushback from some people who don't like the fact that we say that Biden is a disastrous diplomat and that nobody likes him. Well, this is the Daily Telegraph, and it says, "Here comes Biden, the world's worst diplomat." That's the title. And then it goes on to say that Joe Biden has been part of the Washington political ruling class for over half a century, entering the Senate back in 1973, representing the state of Delaware. He has built a well-earned reputation as one of the most crude, narcissistic, and rude politicians of our time. And Biden is a president who exudes incredible arrogance whilst demonstrating a limited understanding of many foreign policy issues, combined with a series of embarrassing gaffes. His presidency has been a monumental disaster on the world stage. And Britain has nothing to learn from Biden's foreign policy and has frequently been the victim of his rambling incoherence and sneering disregard for Britain's past, its democratic decisions, including Brexit, and its key role on the international stage. Anyway, and Biden has been his own worst enemy, and his version of international diplomacy is taking a wrecking ball to America's most valued partnerships and alliances. Well, I'm not saying that that is a universal view of Biden in Britain, but it is, by the way, the view I have. And we see that on the DURAN, we are not the only people to hold it. Anyway, moving on to the other foreign policy crisis that is brewing on the horizon. Janet Yellen is now in China. She's apparently due to have 4 days of meetings, not just 2 days of meetings, with the Chinese leadership. And the most interesting thing about this visit is that the Chinese have been playing it very low key. There's been little of the emphasis or attention given even to Blinken's visit of 2 weeks ago. Nonetheless, we have had a report about this visit from Global Times, and the article speaks about Chinese Premier Li tells Yellen Chinese-US ties can see more rainbows after wind and rain. So, this is what the Chinese are saying. But then, of course, we again have comments that blame for the deterioration is entirely the fault of the United States. Li met Yellen at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. During the meeting, the Chinese premier said that Chinese culture values peace above everything else, as opposed to hegemony and bullying. Well, who then is engaging in hegemony and bullying? Obviously the United States. And then we go on to read, it is hoped that the US will uphold a rational and pragmatic attitude and work with China in the same direction to push bilateral relations back onto the right track at an early date. So the fault for the deterioration is entirely with the United States, with its practice of hegemony and bullying. And then Li apparently went on to say that politicizing economic cooperation or overstretching the concept of security on such cooperation does no good for economic development of the two countries and the whole world. Li further noted that the two sides should strengthen communication and seek consensus on important issues in the bilateral economic field through candid, in-depth and pragmatic exchanges so as to inject stability and positive energy in China-US economic relations. And then we have comments about Yellen's reaction, referring to a rainbow. Yellen said that when she arrived in Beijing on Thursday, Li said China-US relations can also see more rainbows after a round of wind and rain. As the Chinese premier spoke, Yellen listened, constantly smiling and nodding, reading what appeared to be a prepared statement. Yellen said that the leaders of the two countries during the meeting in Bali emphasized that senior officials from our countries should deepen constructive efforts on macroeconomic stability and address shared global challenges. I'm in Beijing to build on that direction. It is my hope that this visit can spur more regular communications between our two countries, and we seek healthy economic competition, not winner take all, but that with a fair set of rules can benefit both countries over time. And then the Chinese were not pleased with the reference to a fair set of rules, because they go on to say that this is from Global Times, there are many differences between the two countries, even as the US constantly cracks down on Chinese firms and restricts high-tech exports to China. Yellen said during her meetings with Chinese officials that she would be communicating concerns from US businesses about China's use of non-market tools. So the Chinese are saying that Yellen is being hypocritical. She talks about fair rules, but in practice it is the United States that is violating those rules. And then we hear that claims are hyped by US politicians in their attempts to crack down on China's development, noting that China has repeatedly provided evidence that there is no such practice. And then Global Times quotes Professor Li Haidong at the Chinese Foreign Affairs University. While the US continues to nitpick and create many problems, bilateral economic and trade relationship is still the ballast stone of China-US relations, and this has not changed. And this brings us to why the Chinese have agreed to see Yellen, which is, of course, as this article from Global Times essentially says, political relations continuing to deteriorate. We're going to see what Xi Jinping said to the Chinese military in a moment. But for the moment, the relationship with the United States continues to work heavily to China's advantage. It's not often realized that last year, 2022, saw an record in Chinese exports to the United States, apparently exceeding the previous highest figure, which was in 2018. And the United States trade deficit with China last year actually widened by 8%. So the Chinese make good profit out of this trade, and if they can keep it running, if they can keep it operating for as long as possible, pragmatic and tough-minded people as they are, they say to themselves, why cut your nose to spite your face? Why wreck economic relations, even whilst they work so massively to China's own economic advantage? And if Yellen comes along saying that she doesn't want to decouple with China because it's not in China, the US's interests to do so, well, let's play along with that, because for as long as we can keep trade running, it works to our advantage, and let's therefore maintain our contacts with the Chinese. Nonetheless, the Chinese do understand that this might not continue forever. The same Global Times article says that there are growing hurdles even for win-win economic and trade cooperation, as Washington continues to put up barriers, including reportedly mulling new restrictions on investments in China and on artificial intelligence chips as part of its overall approach to contain China. The atmosphere is not very appropriate for the two sides to reach any meaningful deal in the economic area, given the growing tensions in overall bilateral relations. In addition to economic and trade crackdowns, Washington has also been constantly provoking tensions with China on multiple fronts, including the Taiwan question and the South China Sea. And the Global Times quotes a research fellow at the Institute of American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Liu Weidong, and he says that the US's strategy has already been established. It will decouple from, crack down, and compete with China. It has become a fundamental US policy. That is why it is so hard for the two countries to reach any meaningful outcome during meetings such as those during Yellen's trip, the restoration of this kind of communication being the only achievement that can be expected for the present. And even as Yellen was coming to China, Xi Jinping gave a speech about military preparedness. And Xinhua, the official Chinese news agency, has published a report about this. It's dated July 6th. Chinese President Xi Jinping stressed efforts to focus on the goals for the centenary of the People's Liberation Army and break new ground for theatre command development and war preparedness. And he made his remarks during his inspection of the headquarters of the PLA Eastern Theatre Command in East China's Jiangsu province on Thursday. Now that apparently is the command that would handle any conflict relating to Taiwan. And Xinhua goes on to say, Xi fully affirmed the significant contributions the command has made since its founding in safeguarding China's territorial integrity, maritime rights and interests, as well as national unity. All of that, of course, refers to Taiwan. Safeguarding China's territorial sovereignty. China claims Taiwan as part of its sovereign territory, its maritime rights and interests, as well as national unity. And national unity means, of course, reunification of Taiwan to the Chinese mainland. And Xi went on to say, as the world has entered a new period of turbulence and transformation, China's security situation is facing rising instability and uncertainty. He called for vigilance against potential dangers and all-out efforts to fulfill the duty of combat tasked with theatre command. He called for enhancing the planning of war and combat, strengthening the command system for joint operations, stepping up training under real combat conditions to raise the force's capabilities to fight and win. And he went on to say that military issues must be considered and handled from a political perspective. The armed forces must have the courage and ability to fight and resolutely safeguard national sovereignty. Again, that's clearly a reference to Taiwan, security, and importantly, development interests. So, at a time when the United States is trying to contain China and restrict its development, Xi Jinping says that the military has a role in defending China's development interests. And then he finishes, the Xinhua report finishes by saying that Xi called for the strengthening party building in all aspects and make the party committee of the theatre command more capable of leading combat readiness, thus fulfilling tasks entrusted by the party and the people. Now, there's been some reports, including one again in the Daily Telegraph, saying that China is preparing for war. And I have to say, this is a chilling message from the Chinese, from Xi Jinping, at a time when Yellen is in Beijing trying to keep some kind of communications open to China, at least on economic issues. And one can't really argue with the claim that Xi Jinping is talking about China preparing for war when one reads in Xinhua about how Xi called for enhancing the planning of war and combat, strengthening the command system for joint operations, stepping up training under real combat conditions to raise the force's capabilities to fight and win. None of this means that China wants war or is looking for it. As Li, the Chinese Prime Minister, pointed out, as the Chinese Prime Minister, Prime Minister Li Qiang pointed out to Yellen, the Chinese culture is peaceful. They are not looking for war. They oppose hegemony and bullying. But if they have to defend themselves, they will do so. And that's the meaning of what Xi Jinping is saying. That's the meaning that he conveys. And alongside that article about Yellen's visit, we have had another very tough article from Global Times, editorial rather, from Global Times. And it says, NATO's hidden agenda against China exposed in advance by Lithuania. And the editorial reads, NATO is set to hold a summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. As the host country, Lithuania appears both excited and impatient. A significant part of this sentiment is reflected in its provocation of China. At the same time, several other NATO members also appear to have coordinated in their approach to Taiwan Island. They have all exposed the upcoming NATO summit's malicious intentions towards China. This cannot be ignored by the Chinese people, who must remain vigilant. And then Global Times speaks mockingly about the fact that Lithuania has announced an Indo-Pacific strategy. And it says the most eye-catching part of this 16-page strategy, which is in inverted commas, is a statement on the Taiwan question, emphasizing the development of economic relations with Taiwan as one of Lithuania's strategic priorities. And Global Times says it even shamelessly draws a red line, claiming that the status quo in the Taiwan Straits cannot be changed via the use of force or coercion. And then the article, the editorial goes on to say, it is bizarre that a Baltic country with a population of less than 3 million, located in the direct radiation zone of the Russia-Ukrainian conflict, has come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy. Many of its wordings for the strategy are familiar, as if they have been directly taken from US rhetoric towards China, only this time being voiced by Lithuania. What is even more jaw-dropping is that Lithuania's foreign minister claimed that with the strategy having been approved, Lithuania now finds itself amongst global leaders. Only someone completely lacking self-awareness could make such a statement. But then the point that the article makes, the editorial makes, is that Lithuania would never have engaged in this kind of performance if it was not reflecting opinion in Washington, and that Lithuania is simply announcing or simply exposing what the intentions, the ultimate intentions, the United States has towards China. And the article, the editorial, also points out that leaders of 4 Asia-Pacific countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand, will also be attending the Vilnius summit, the NATO summit in Vilnius, and that the Lithuania's role is not is the grand chess game played by NATO and US is not influenced by Lithuania. Lithuania is merely a pawn which has crossed the Rubicon, encouraged and pushed forward without considering retreat. So there we go. And it isn't just Lithuania. The editorial also points out that the UK and Poland have also signed a 2030 strategic partnership joint declaration, which also meddles in the Taiwan question. So we see that the Chinese, at the moment, are trying to keep the economic relationship which works in their interest with the United States going, but at the same time, they are clearly preparing for what I suspect they increasingly see as an inevitable clash over Taiwan. It is for them the reddest of red lines, just as Ukraine was for Russia. The West shows no understanding or concern or regard for that. It presses on with its support of Taiwan, or at least of the authorities in Taiwan, and Xi Jinping, for his part, is now telling the military that they have to prepare for war. Now, I recall that back in the autumn of 2021, even as the Russians were engaged in last-ditch negotiations with the Western powers, not just over Ukraine, but about the security architecture of Europe, President Putin met with Russian military leaders, gave a speech which I interpreted in a video for this channel as a signal that he was telling them to prepare for war, that conflict was on its way. And I can't help but feel that through these latest statements, Xi Jinping is engaging in the same exercise. The Chinese, like the Russians, increasingly feel that the United States is pushing them into a position which they do not want to go to, but where they're being left with no choice but to contemplate military action because of the way in which not just the United States, but its allies seem to be determined to encroach upon Taiwan, Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. And all of this is coming shortly after we've heard reports that a Chinese war game has apparently gained the destruction of a US carrier group with 24 hypersonic missiles, Chinese hypersonic missiles. Well, there we go. Let's hope, let's pray that the brakes are indeed put on, that Yellen does find some way of stabilizing the situation, though I have to say, comments that she makes hardly make me think that she is really on side for peace in this matter. But it does seem astonishing that even as the United States is now scraping the barrel, trying to find weapons to keep Ukraine fighting, including cluster munitions, the kind of munitions whose use it itself only a short time ago condemned, it seems to be continuing to invite a further conflict with China over Taiwan. We live in interesting times, and I fear that they might become more interesting still. We will see whether the realists in Washington, what they're able to do, and we will also have to see how the electoral calculus in the United States plays out as all of these preparations for war continue. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. And just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also go to our shop, get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. Last but not, also remember you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.